Here's a headline. Social media use linked to rising depression in teens. And here's how it gets reported. Social media is making our teenagers depressed. Same study, same data, but the second sentence says something the first one didn't. The first is an association. The second is a cause. That gap between what a study's design can support and what people say about it is everywhere. In the news headlines, in policy arguments, in TED Talks, sometimes even in the papers themselves. In the last video, we mapped the landscape of research design. We looked at observation, experimentation, and the trade-offs between them. That gave us the vocabulary. Today, we build the toolkit. By the end of this video, I want you to be able to take any study and answer 3 things. What kind of evidence is this? What kind of claim does it justify? And where has the language gone beyond what the design supports? Here's the core framework. Different kinds of claims require different kinds of evidence, and we can think of these as levels on a ladder, where each level demands stronger design logic. Level 1, descriptive claims. These say, this is what exists. 63% of Australian university students report moderate or high stress. That's a description. It tells you the prevalence of something in a sample. It requires measurement, and the quality of that measurement still matters, as we discussed in week 3, but it doesn't claim any relationship between variables. A well-designed study can support a descriptive claim. That's its job. Level 2, associative claims. These say these 2 things go together. Students who sleep less report higher anxiety. Screen time is correlated with lower well-being. Exercise is associated with fewer depressive symptoms. These claims require a design that measures 2 or more variables and examines the relationship between them. Surveys and correlational studies do this well. But notice what associative claims do not say. They don't say which variable came first, and they don't say what caused the other. Level 3, causal claims. These say, this changed that. The mindfulness intervention reduced anxiety. The growth mindset program improved grades. Random assignment to breakfast eating lowered depressive symptoms. Causal claims require designs with manipulation, comparison, and ideally random assignment. The logic we covered in detail in weeks 2 and in the last lecture. Now, there are finer distinctions you could make: predictive claims that establish temporal order, mechanistic claims that explain how a cause works. But for this course, the critical boundary is between associative and causal, because that is where most of the inflation happens. Language inflation is when the words used to describe a finding imply a stronger claim than the design supports. And it's the single most common critical thinking failure you'll encounter in psychology. Not in the statistics, not in the method sections, but in the way findings get talked about. Let me show you how it works. Example 1, the obvious case. A cross-sectional survey finds that people who use social media more frequently report lower life satisfaction. The design is observational. There's no manipulation, no random assignment. The strongest justified claim is associative. Social media use and life satisfaction are negatively correlated. The headline reads, social media lowers life satisfaction. That's a causal claim. The word lower implies that social media did something to life satisfaction, but the design can't support that. This is inflation, and in this case, it's easy to spot. Example 2, the subtler case. A longitudinal study measures screen time and depressive symptoms in adolescents at 2 time points, a year apart. Higher screen times at time 1 predicts higher depression at time 2. This is stronger than a cross-sectional survey. There's temporal order. Screen time was measured before depression. The paper concludes screen time contributes to adolescent depression. The word contributes implies causation, but does temporal order alone give us that? Not quite. The groups still weren't randomly assigned. Adolescents who use screens more at time 1 may have already differed in ways that predict later depression. Family environment, prior mental health, socioeconomic status. Temporal order rules out reverse causation in one direction, but it doesn't rule out confounding. So the design supports a predictive claim. Screen time at time 1 is associated with depression at time 2. It doesn't fully support a causal one. Example 3, the case inside the paper. A randomized experiment assigns participants to either a social media break or continued use for 2 weeks. The break group reports lower anxiety afterward. The paper's abstract says, reducing social media use improves mental health. Now this sounds justified. It's an experiment after all, but look more carefully. The outcome was self-reported anxiety in a sample of university students over 2 weeks. Mental health is far broader than what was measured, and improves implies a general benefit that may not extend beyond this specific operationalization, this population, and this time frame. Even in experiments, inflation can happen, not in the causal direction, but in the scope of the claim. Here's a quick check. A study reports gratitude journaling boosts happiness. What questions would you need answered before you accepted that sentence? What was the design? Observational or experimental? How was happiness operationalized? Life satisfaction, momentary mood, something else? How was gratitude journaling defined and measured? Who were the participants? How long was the study? Each of these shapes what the claim actually means and whether the language is justified by the evidence. You already know the 3 features that define experimental design. In week 2, we introduced them as properties of strong experiments. Now I want you to use them differently. Not as a checklist for what makes a good study, but as diagnostic questions you ask of any study you encounter. Question 1, is there a manipulation? Did the researcher deliberately change the independent variable, or did they measure something that already existed? If there's no manipulation, reverse causation is on the table. Question 2, is there a comparison condition? What is being compared to what? Is there a control group, a baseline, a pre-treatment measure? If there's no comparison, you can't approximate the counterfactual. You don't know what would have happened otherwise. Question 3, was assignment random? How did participants end up in each condition? Did the researcher assign them or did they sort themselves? If assignment wasn't random, confounding is on the table. The groups may differ in systematic ways that have nothing to do with the manipulation. These 3 questions take about 10 seconds to apply to any study, and they immediately tell you where you are on the inference ladder. All 3 present? Well, you're in the territory of causal claims. Manipulation and comparison, but no random assignment? Quasi-experimental. The causal logic is approximated, but not guaranteed. No manipulation at all? Observational. The design supports associative claims, but not causal ones. This is the toolkit. It's simple, and it works on everything. Journal articles, news reports, TED Talks, podcast claims, arguments at dinner. Let me show you the full toolkit in action. You came across this claim in a news article. Researchers find that mindfulness meditation reduces workplace burnout. Your job is to diagnose it. Step 1, find the design. You look up the original study. It's a cross-sectional survey of 800 employees at several large companies. Employees self-reported how often they practiced mindfulness and completed a burnout questionnaire. Step 2, apply the diagnostic questions. Is there a manipulation? No. Nobody was assigned to practice mindfulness. Employees who already practiced were compared to those who didn't. Is there a comparison? In a loose sense, the researchers compared high mindfulness and low mindfulness groups, but these groups formed themselves. It's not a designed comparison. Was assignment random? No. People chose whether to practice mindfulness. Step 3, place it on the inference ladder. No manipulation, no random assignment. This is observational. The design supports an associative claim. Mindfulness practices and lower burnout go together. Step 4, check the language. The headline said, reduces. That's causal. The design is associative. There's a gap. The word reduces is doing more work than the evidence supports. Step 5, consider what else might explain the association. Employees who practice mindfulness may differ in many ways. Personality, job type, seniority, workload, coping style, prior mental health, any of these could explain the association. And notice the measurement layer. Both mindfulness and burnout were self-reported. That means social desirability, memory distortion, and shared method variance are all in play. Two self-report measures from the same person at the same time will often correlate, partly because of how people respond to questionnaires, not just because the constructs are related. Then you have to ask, what would strengthen the claim? A randomized experiment assigning employees to a mindfulness program versus a control condition. Measuring burnout before and after would move us from an associative claim toward a causal one. A longitudinal design measuring mindfulness at time 1 and burnout at time 2 would at least establish temporal order. But the cross-sectional survey on its own earns an association, a useful one, but still an association. So here's the principle that ties all of this together. Your confidence in a claim should be proportional to what the design supports. Not all evidence is equal, but all evidence tells you something. A single correlational study doesn't tell you nothing. It tells you two things go together, which is worth knowing, but it earns modest confidence about causation. A well-designed experiment earns stronger causal confidence, but perhaps modest confidence about generalizability. A convergence of multiple designs, observational, experimental, longitudinal, across different samples and operationalizations earns the most. And this is what calibrated confidence means. Not cynicism, not treating every study as worthless until proven otherwise, and not credulity, not accepting every finding at face value. It means matching your belief to the evidence. And the tool for doing that is always the same. Look at the design, ask the diagnostic questions, find your position on the inference ladder, and check whether the language matches. If it does, you can trust the claim at the level of confidence it's earned. If it doesn't, you've found the gap. And now you know exactly what additional evidence would close it. Here is the central norm of week 4. Design earns the right to make a claim. If the design is observational, the claim must be associative. If the design is experimental, the claim can be causal, but bounded by context, measurement, and sample. If the design is longitudinal, it earns temporal ordering, but not necessarily causation. When claims outrun designs, that's not a difference of opinion. That's an error. And the skill you now have, the diagnostic questions, the inference ladder, the language check, is portable. You can apply it to anything. A journal article, a news headline, a policy brief, a conversation. Most people never develop the skill. You're developing it now. In the workshop, you'll apply this toolkit to a real case. You've read about the pitch drop, the demonstration that's been running at UQ since 1927, often called the world's longest running experiment. Your job is to put it through the diagnostic questions, to place it on the inference ladder, to ask what it can tell us and what it can't. And then to think about what you would need to change about the pitch drop to move it from one level of inference to another. That's the exercise. The toolkit is yours. Now use it. And if you haven't done so yet, be sure you go over and visit the pitch drop experiment in person. I'll see you in the workshop. Thanks.